Hello, and welcome to our presentation on the ethics of loot boxes. My name is Jasper Lumen, and I will be taking you through the opening and introduction sections of the presentation. In this presentation, we will first introduce the problem context, then discuss the problem through different ethical frameworks. These include act utilitarianism, rule utilitarianism, Kantian deontology, John Rawls' theory of justice, and virtue ethics. Finally, we will conclude our presentation. So, what are loot boxes? Loot boxes are consumable virtual items that a user can redeem for a selection of randomized in-game rewards. They are implemented in a variety of different ways, rewarding players with only cosmetic rewards that don't have an effect on gameplay, or giving players rewards that give some kind of in-game advantage. For example, a player could receive some kind of in-game currency, or get a new weapon in a combat game. With many different implementations to choose from, our presentation will study the loot box system in the game Apex Legends, published by Electronic Arts. Let's have a look at stakeholders and their responsibilities. First, we have developers. They're responsible for writing code that follows the ACM Code of Ethics, building a game that meets the publisher's expectation criteria, and building a game that players enjoy and want to play. Next, we have the publisher or publishing company. They're responsible for publishing games that sell well and make their investors money, and publishing quality games that players enjoy. They're also responsible for providing game content information to consumers so that consumers know what they're purchasing. Next up are parents of young players. Their responsibilities include monitoring what games their children are playing, making sure they control their money, as in not giving their child unchecked access to a credit card, and ensuring they are aware of contents of games they purchase for their child. Finally, we have players. Players are responsible for being conscious of money they spend in-game, knowing what content is in games they purchase, choosing which games to support, and balancing gaming with the rest of life. Now let's look at some of the ethical issues that come from using loot boxes. One big ethical consideration around loot boxes is that they can be considered as a form of gambling. Many players have a large amount of minors as part of their player base, and since companies want to make the most money they can, they are likely to exploit this vulnerable population by making loot boxes as attractive to minors as possible, adding flashy lights, exciting sounds, and enticing in-game rewards. This is very similar to how slot machines work, and studies have shown that increased spending on loot boxes is linked with increased problem gambling, either by exploiting existing problem gambling or causing it. These studies also show that the link is much stronger in adolescents than when compared to adults. Loot boxes do come with some benefits, though. For publishers and game companies, they are a very profitable way to monetize a game. This in turn can allow them to better support the game and support it for longer. For players, the loot box benefits come in a few forms. First, they can sometimes help the player progress through the game. They also provide a fun little minigame, a flash of light, color, and sound, accompanied by that rush of anticipation in getting something new. Lastly, the increased support that the game can receive from the publishing company is also of benefit to the player, and players, of course, also benefit from a free-to-play model of game.
Hi, my name is Rick Fain. I've been doing an ethical analysis of loot box onto act utilitarianism. From a consequentialist standpoint, act utilitarians do not concern themselves with the reason or motivation of an action to determine whether it is ethical. Instead, they look at the consequences of such action and formulate ethical decisions. For act utilitarians, they focus on maximizing happiness and pleasure in the moment. Loot boxes have instrumental value because they provide many different kinds of skin for legends, weapons, and voice lines that can be used in-game and even viewed during loading times. Under the idea of quantitative act utilitarianism, the loot boxes provide more engagement in-game because people will want to play more games when they get something brand new, which produces more pleasure. Satisfies the player's vanity when they show off in-game. The only potential negative utility is that player might have to spend a lot of money to only have a chance of obtaining their desired item. However, loot boxes can still be obtained for free as player progress through games. Therefore, it is an overall pleasure provided to players. This pleasure is increased for unique loot boxes during special events. They often contain rare event skins that might not be available for purchase or obtain from loot boxes ever again. This gave the sense of exclusivity towards the item. The structure and concept of loot boxes of Apex Legends does not violate any of the foundations of quantitative utilitarianism.
Oh my god. Oh, wait, that's a mythic! Wait, is that a mythic? You got the line! Oh my god! What?
For qualitative utilitarians, they consider quality of the utility or pleasure. After spending money on loot boxes, what people get in return is lower level bodily pleasure such as vanity. By spending around hundreds of dollars, players could have instead utilized that money to get higher level intellectual pleasure such as purchasing and reading books. Despite not being unethical, loot boxes would be discouraged according to qualitative utilitarians.
Hi, I'm Nigam Ladd, and I'll be covering the ethical analysis of loot boxes under rule utilitarianism. From a rule utilitarian perspective, the mechanics of the Apex packs are very manipulative and are not deemed ethical. Rule utilitarianism is concerned with living by rules that would lead to good consequences for the greatest amount of people. For example, consider the player's risk of losing large amounts of money to these mechanics, and the financial benefit it provides to developers and the publisher. If the practice of implementing loot boxes in all games is generally followed, then this would cause players to reject playing video games, thus leading developers and publishers to no longer be able to make money from their games. In the short term, players are getting a short burst of dopamine, and the developers and publishers are making quick cash. However, in the long term, this would not fare well for either party. People would lose faith in developers making games and being a good source of entertainment, and publishers would no longer be able to pay developers to continue making games that players enjoy. For this reason, under rule utilitarianism, there is a moral obligation to avoid this practice.
When does actual gameplay start? As soon as we're done sating our hunger for loot boxes.
The principle of harm reduction by the ACM Code of Ethics is a general rule that can be applied to loot boxes. With the benefits and risks of loot boxes laid out, it is better for society if developers excluded loot boxes or loot box mechanics in video games. This is because there is more utility in removing the risks involved with having them than the short-term happiness obtained from them. If developers were to abide by this rule, they would deem it morally impermissible. According to consequentialist theories, whether an act is morally permissible or not solely depends on the consequences resulting from it. This would take into consideration all the consequences to the stakeholders resulting from the distribution and sale of loot boxes. Consequentialism holds the implication that the nature of what is being done before is not being considered, but rather the aftermath of the act is the only thing held to analyze. The consequence of opening boxes in the game can lead to negative impacts on the users, owners, and associates. For example, the consequences to the user can lead to financial distress, and therefore goes against the utility of the loot boxes, which is its short-term pleasure response. Furthermore, the rule utilitarian would project this negative attribution of its consequences to make loot boxes have no utility towards individuals or groups' overall levels of joy or happiness, and accentuates the ideals that loot boxes goes against.
Hi, I'm Brandon Unger, and I will be covering the ethical analysis of loot boxes with Kant's deontology. The second foundation of Kant's deontology outlines that one must always treat humanity with respect, and never just a mere means to an end. To do this, one must not deny them any relevant information and allow them the freedom of choice. However, the current implementation of loot boxes fails in respecting the player's autonomy by limiting relevant information and developing flash mechanics in order to increase the player's drive to use them.
Do you consider loot boxes to be an ethical feature of your games?
So what we look at as surprise mechanics.
Loot boxes have a chance to give a player a flashy or cool item. However, the chances are not random, but specific to each item. Many of these mechanics do not publish the rates that the items can be obtained at. This is to allow the player to overestimate their chances that they would receive a rare item. For example, a player might suspect they have a 1 to 2% chance to get a rare item, where the drop rate of that item may actually be much lower, at half or even a quarter%. Under Kant's deontology, this would be considered denying the player relevant information. Moreover, elements are added to these mechanics in order to make them more exciting and engaging by creating a form of arousal, called arousal prior. For example, when opening a loot box, the animation shows the box shaking for a period of time before showing the items explode out of the box. These mechanics can give the illusion that the player is receiving a better value for their money. Lee outlined that loot boxes trigger arousal prior, which is an increase in arousal and highly associated with the anticipation of risk, but more importantly, also reward. Arousal prior is the same kind of arousal that can be found when using slot machines. As gambling is protected for those who are vulnerable and loot boxes are not, the companies are not respecting this minority, but instead targeting them by stripping away their free will to choose. Loot boxes are being misrepresented in order to get the players to pay as much money as they can. By withholding relevant information and not respecting the player's will, the current implementation of loot boxes is treating the player as a means to an end, and would be considered unethical according to Kant's deontology.
Hello, my name is Jack Trun, and I will be analyzing loot boxes from a virtue ethics perspective. Virtue ethics aims to develop a person's character through learning and practicing virtuous actions and thoughts. To build good character, Aristotle urges people to aim towards the golden mean, or virtues that lie between two extremes called vices. It is reasonable to assume that the character of stakeholders affects decisions made regarding the implementation of loot boxes. Being the publisher, Electronic Arts must find a balance between being generous enough to keep players engaged and making a profit. They maintain a steady player base by allowing players to earn loot boxes through gameplay and implementing duplicate compensation. Being too greedy may drive away potential new players, while being overly generous could disincentivize players from making a purchase. The publisher also needs to be transparent and honest about the draw probability of loot boxes, which Apex does show to the players. Being deceitful about the details of loot boxes is considered a crime in many countries, and may land them in legal troubles. However, advertising loot boxes as not being a worthy investment can lose Apex its source of revenue. For the development team, it is necessary to cooperate with the publisher to develop a fair and marketable loot box system. Being non-compliant would risk the team losing investors and funding from the publisher. But being too compliant with the publisher's demands could damage their product and reputation. For example, a disagreement between players and developers from Respawn Entertainment about Apex's heirloom items led to an argument on social media in 2019. This greatly damaged the player base's trust. To protect themselves, players need to have the self-discipline to limit their spending or not engage with loot boxes altogether, especially if they have an addictive personality. Even players with the income to support excessive spending on loot boxes should abstain from doing so, because it will set a precedent for publishers to further abuse loot box mechanics in the future.
My name is Brent Armino, and I was in charge of writing John Rawls' Theories of Justice. So, as to follow his theories, the concept of loot boxes in Apex Legends really doesn't interfere or combat with his ideas in any grand way. Rawls argues that an equally distributed amount of resources is given to any party, and that follows along with the random drops of loot boxes gained from playing the game itself. While there's an extra way to pay extra cash and in turn be given more loot crates, the natural distribution of them comes predominantly from playing the game and then have the random chance at the drop. or from leveling up and receiving one. The idea of equal opportunities and a chance is again reiterated inside the system of the game, as any one person has the same chance as another to get a box and unlock a rare or legendary item within it. While it isn't ever a guarantee of something good in a crate, it supports Rawls' idea of fairness and equal chance. The only conflicting portion is the ability to purchase these packs at a cost of trading real money for in-game coins. Although this is a conflict of the equal distribution, all the items within the boxes are purely cosmetic and are therefore not interfering with any other player's experience, other than some potential jealousy. However, if we look deeper into the game system, we understand that there are some items that aren't available to every player. There are special cosmetic items in Apex Legends called heirlooms, which are special decorations for characters in the game. These extremely rare items can only be obtained two ways: by opening 500 Apex loot boxes or unlocking all the items in something called a collection event. For the average player, it makes this nearly impossible to obtain. Wealthier players are likely to spend large sums of money on crates to unlock different heirlooms, whereas people that choose to go to the free-to-play route only receive half the amount of crates as their pay-to-play counterparts. The free players will therefore need to spend money if they truly desire these kinds of rare items. For John Rawls' theory of justice, locking these heirlooms behind a paywall, despite it being purely cosmetic or not, is immoral in Rawls' view. Equally distributed amounts of resources for every player is what Rawls would have strived for, and therefore every player should have the same equal opportunity for any one item.
This will be the conclusion to our ethical analysis of Apex Legends loot box system. For the benefits, loot boxes are widely used as a primary or supplementary monetization system. Revenue from loot box sales may be used to fund additional content for players. Loot boxes can have a similar effect on players as gambling has on gamblers, such as increasing the level of chemicals like serotonin and dopamine. However, when we examine the drawbacks of loot boxes, we can see that it far outweighs the benefits they provide. From an ACT utilitarian view, loot boxes only provide lower-level bodily pleasures, such as vanity and the release of pleasurable chemicals. Players need to weigh the benefits and drawbacks of buying loot boxes to decide if it is worth the cost. From a rule utilitarian perspective, the issue is that loot boxes provide financial support to the developers and publisher at the cost of mentally and financially exploiting the players. EA and Respawn Entertainment should opt to implement a more consumer-friendly monetization system. Kant Deontology is concerned with the way flashy lootbox animations are used to lure players into spending money, and the implications of lootbox rates being misleading or false. The solution is for governments to set regulations on the presentation of loot boxes and enforce displaying and auditing loot box rates. Most players do not have an equal opportunity to obtain heirloom items from Apex loot boxes, which are almost impossible to obtain for regular players. Players should be able to obtain heirloom items without having to collect all other items from the loot box. Finally, virtue ethics questions the character of developers and publishers that abuse loot box mechanics for maximum profit. Game creators must be held accountable for their actions regarding monetization and loot boxes and the consequences that follow. Loot boxes are quickly becoming the preferred monetization method for many game makers, especially large game corporations. And despite being less ethical than other methods and having aspects similar to gambling, there are few legal constraints on their usage. Governments around the world must pass regulations and legislations to protect consumers and vulnerable populations from unethical loot box practices so that they do not get abused further. Thank you for listening to our essay.